Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Forrest. I recently gave this talk to the Infographics Congress in the Netherlands, but that wasn't recorded on video. So I thought I'd just go ahead and give my presentation so I could share it with multiple people. Predominantly, I would say that everything in this video will be discussing AI, text-to-image generative models, specifically as it relates to the design of information, hopefully with data. So I am a New York City-based data designer and writer. I wear a few hats these days. I'm currently the director of the McKinsey Data Visualization Lab. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of Nightingale, the journal of the Data Visualization Society, where you can find a lot of my articles. Here's my contact information at the bottom. You'll see I have largely the same kind of login on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Discord. So yeah, give me a follow, and always happy to chat with folks. I feel like I need to start this talk by coming out as a semi-obsessive compulsive collector of isotypes. Isotypes in pictorial statistics are a certain type of data visualization, largely from the mid-century, started initially by Otto and Marie Neurath, but practiced by many people. I'm in the act of writing a book about isotype, but it's actually this pairing of image and data, which gives us a really unique way of teaching people things visually. In the act of writing this book about isotype and becoming really totally obsessed with it, I realized that my interest in collecting also became a kind of a mania to kind of find the most obscure and unique examples. And I'm still collecting the books, and I'll get back to it. But at the same time, I had a gnawing feeling that I just wanted to create something on my own. And maybe it was the byproduct of the whole NFT craze or just a general curiosity about generative art. But one day I clicked on a Twitter link and found myself looking at Midjourney back in March, about a week or so after it launched. The concept of text-to-image generation has been around for years. And while I found it really conceptually interesting, I always felt like the results were pretty uninspiring, but I don't know, Midjourney seemed different, so why not? Specifically, Midjourney is a bot that lives on a Discord channel, and Discord, for those of you that don't know, is a social media app built for gamers to share images and chat. I'm sure they would probably define it a little differently, but there you go. How it works is simple. After you join the community, you're invited to, quote, start imagining images by sending a text prompt to the bot. But like I said, Discord's a social network, so everything is public and everybody in the channel, all their kind of tricks and keywords are open. So all you have to do is kind of go through and kind of cut and paste things. And that's really exciting, but let me tell you that Midjourney is also just kind of a lot to keep up with. There's really a never-ending flow of images, and it can actually be kind of exhausting. So after you submit the prompt, you get 4 thumbnails grouped in a quadrant. From there, you have the ability to create more variations, and you can make the images larger and more detailed by upscaling them. This results in a stream of images that can lead you in bewildering directions with many iterations. And this diagram shows the sample workflow with 3 variations and 4 upscaled images, the variations in yellow and upscaled images in green. And here are my first decent attempt at creating isotypes in Midjourney. I was immediately captured by the design possibilities this technology brings to my research. Looking at each image, you can see a certain internal logic at work, a grid structure, the uniform color, the reference to labels, titles, units, legends, etc. Over time, I've actually started to think about these as isotypes without subject matter. So I started to add prompts that suggested data and referred to existing images that I was familiar with. This series of images based on farmyard comparisons clearly shows the organizations of the categories by color and shape as formatted on a grid. But there's really way more going on. Midjourney is creating new images based on the image libraries it was built from. In this case, the images were created based on the photo documentation of isotype charts found in books. The crease pages, aged paper, and even background of the table was generated by the AI because that's just what isotypes look like. I've also liked the fact that the AI took the profile of a cow on the left and rotated it 90 degrees to show the cow facing on the right. Certainly, it makes sense that a cow would be drawn from both perspectives, and the AI pieced them together based on the relative context of the available images it had been trained on. And so at this point, I realized I really had no idea what was happening at all. Since June, I've been trying to read a lot of articles about text-to-image generative models, but I still need to caveat this that I still don't really know how any of this stuff works. And that's largely because the technology behind this is extremely complex, as the field of kind of AI research is a mix of computer science and abstract mathematics, neither of which I have any background in, predominantly being a designer. On the left, you can see diagrams of the last 4 generations of generative models spanning from 2017 to 2022. The formula on the right is explaining the math behind a diffusion model, which is actually the latest development that's pushing a lot of the innovation that we're seeing now. It's the bottom on the left. And it's best to think of these text-to-image platforms as a chain of neural networks, not a single model. The text prompt is entered, Snake drives a car, it's processed through a neural network to decode the text, and then it's matched with a second neural network to connect the words to images that represent the prompt. Of course, it's actually all just math. The handshake from the previous slide is a series of mathematical outputs that are matched using a set of filters and decoders. And like a sophisticated machine, each step in the chain has its own complexities and nuances. The resulting images aren't the result of a single process, but rather the result of different approaches assembling different neural network components. And the modular structure of these platforms is actually the most exciting aspect, as it allows different teams to create different combinations. Since AI research is ultimately a small community, this is leading to collaboration between the various groups, and the innovation is nothing short of incredible, but I'll get to that at the end. So Dalle2 was created 2 months later in mid-June, and it swept through the community to breathless reviews. It was created by a commercial research company called OpenAI, which created some of the foundational models, such as GPT-3 and CLIP. As I started to test it, I made a prompt with more keywords than I needed so that I could see how Dalle2 would react. And unfortunately, it does not have the same kind of image library that Midjourney uses, and the prompt was pretty much ignored, as you can see. But the results were kind of weird and interesting, so I started to create variations. I'm primarily interested in exploring these tools as a way of finding new data viz design patterns. These bar charts are arty, but there's really nothing preventing them from being mapped to real data. And the next iteration of the images put more photographic textures into the bars on the left and positions the chart title over the chart. And I mean, why not? The image on the right breaks the charts into 2 groups of small multiples. These are not charts per se, but they may provide the kind of inspiration to create a design that leverages visual innovations. Later iterations created fantastic combinations of data attributable designs that suggest the shapes of Sankey's, bar charts, collage, pictographs, or even cross sections, but somehow all mixed up on the same chart. It feels meaningful, but you don't really know for what. I made this around mid-June, and after a few days exploring Dalle2, I decided to return to Midjourney. Now, I'd like to walk through my first major project using this technology. For context, the supply chain has regularly been in the news for the last year or so, and I found myself wondering if such a complex system could even be visualized because it's just so vast. And here's the prompt: Supply Chain Economics by Isotype, Unreal Engine. And I think it's an elegant statement, as it creates a lot of context in only 7 words. The text prompts describe what the image should be, and the modifiers provide some instruction of how it should be rendered. In this case, supply chain economics is both meaningful and ambiguous. Unreal Engine is a 3D engine that's used by many video games. It tells the model to create a 3D image and that it should be realistic, but not necessarily photographic. By Isotype informs on the style, time period, and infers a unit of measurement. The first results delivered 4 thumbnails, which you can see on the left, And I chose to upscale the image on the bottom right, which you, of course, can see on the right side. But here's where we really get started. The pattern is transformed into a kind of port. The texture has been separated into stacked objects, and we have a horizon filled with cranes in the distance. To date, I have rendered 1,073 images in this series. I would argue that most of the images are compelling on their own, but what's far more interesting is how the evolution of the images visualizes the story of the supply chain. In this case, both images elaborate on the port concept, and the right image is rare in that it shows a single ship and cranes. The left image implies a sunset at the top of the image. Versions of the port give way to a cityscape. The rows of color become more defined as shipping containers, docks, pipes, even some empty ground is visible. The horizon for both images is both naturalistic, and a new day is dawning. A few images later, the port transforms into a train yard. Gone are the implied waterways. Now we see the three pathways again converging into a series of cranes. Note that the right image shows the goods inside the shipping containers in racks. A few iterations later, and I was totally stopped dead in my tracks. The AI moved the train yard inside to create a warehouse. And I've created many versions of the warehouse images, and there are different trends that drive the story from here on diverging paths. In some sequences, the cargo gets smaller and more discrete. In others, the bulky machinery takes different forms. In some images, the individual parts are laid out in lines, which I've come to interpret as a factory. In the image on the left, the factory floor is flanked by document boxes, you can see on the left. But on the right, we see that same wall as interpreted as carts full of bundles. Keep in mind, I'm guiding Midjourney at this point to make versions and upscale the results, then make more versions, more upscales. I've not changed the initial text prompt at all. I'm only telling it more images like this. The color-coded collections of parts on the left and the natural cardboard on the right shows how deep the contextual network of associations is to the concept of the supply chain, and none of that was in the original prompt. The factory series eventually drops the background altogether, and the products become smaller. On the left, the products break into sorted bundles. On the right, the bundles are flanking a kind of automobile chassis. But an iteration later of those images transforms the bundles into queues of people. Certainly, this feels reminiscent of factory workers waiting in lines to clock in, but what can't escape the more recent images of exiled migrants traveling with all they could carry? Of the 1,000 or so images in the series, there are only actually about 10 images that represent people, and I'm not still exactly sure what that means. Maybe the worker isn't as contextually relevant for the concept of the supply chain, or maybe they just aren't photographed enough. And being photographed is a crucial step as Midjourney creates images from other images. In this case, a quick Google search easily finds a series of stock photos that all have the same elements, a top-down view of shipping containers organized into rows stretching into the distance. And only this past Monday, I think that would have been September, actually the last day of August, a tool was created to explore the 12 million of the 2.3 billion images used in the image library for Stable Diffusion. This representative sample is fascinating as half of the images were sourced from only 100 URLs. The largest were Pinterest, WordPress, Blogspot, along with other image services like Flickr, Tumblr, DeviantArt, and Wikimedia. Unsurprisingly, about 900,000 images came from stock photo sites. And here you'll see, even in the screen grab we have, 3 of them are using the same image. These duplications help to weight the results of supply chain to default to its compositional archetype. And then just like that, Midjourney v3 was launched without warning on July 27th. And the difference between V2 and V3 is major. Not only does Midjourney create images that are almost double the resolution of V2, it also creates far more detail. But that's not really the whole story. There's a lot more to Midjourney than the image library. And as a research team, they have focused on creating more aesthetically beautiful images. When V3 was launched, Midjourney started also doing some office hours, and its visionary leader, David Holtz, would just simply make himself available for 3 or 4 hours to answer questions for anybody that dropped by. And hearing David speak about philosophy, technology, ethics, community standards, and also the creative potential of this technology is totally amazing and verges on the spiritual. And he really sees this technology as a tool for creative exploration, and his team continues to push for, quote, more beauty. And one day, while he was talking about something, he said in a totally offhand comment, maybe it's too beautiful. And I've thought about that comment ever since. V3 also applies a more painterly aesthetic. The model is adding more and more aesthetic choices, and this pushes the image to have more emotional resonance. This image feels particularly haunting as the walls on either side feel like a gallows inspecting the factory floor below. Those shapes could be people up there. The background has again been stripped, but the industrial apparatus and cardboard boxes below are highlighted with an oddly even light. It almost feels kind of posed. And the warehouse thread took an interesting turn as the spaces themselves became so large that I had to rename this section to be cold storage. And I really like the environments themselves. They're dusty, silent, very impersonal. Again, these images feel more like master paintings than what we would expect from something called AI-generated art. Then, after only 80 or 90 iterations, Midjourney started returning images of nature. The industrial debris literally stretches to the horizon, but this is a world where nature has taken over. Zooming in, you can see the rusty images seem partially submerged, overtaken by vines and standing water. A few versions later, the machines are gone entirely, and we're presented with a canal for logging. The sky is clearing, and while the water is still an inky black, the image feels much more optimistic. And eventually, V3 started generating images of farms. At last, the scene is all natural, and I think this is actually where the series will end. But on a personal note, this was also when my wife started getting worried, as I was obsessed with creating these kinds of images, and I was still struggling to understand why they were so compelling. The design decisions felt so meaningful, yet so random. And I began to think about indeterminacy and started to search for academic papers where I stumbled across 2 topics of research: Cyril Klein's work on indeterminacy in database management, referring to the attributes of language in a data system, as well as a book about the curious use of ambiguity by modernist painters to create images between abstract and representational. And this led to a few days of reading about semantics, and I found a world of research about semantics in language. But when I looked into the research on the semantics of images, what immediately materialized were many, many articles written by data scientists and AI researchers. Reading this helped me to realize that text and images are specific and vague in different ways. The words at the left are all tagged to this completely random image on Wikipedia, but they would not be as equally meaningful if they were turned into pictures by themselves. Certainly, there are images of Bollywood movies that are used to illustrate the term, but there's not a single image for the industry as a whole. Likewise, the word successful is entirely difficult to picture. I think that the secret to designing meaningful generative images is understanding that handshake between text and image semantics. Because our language translates our thoughts into a signal for another person, a certain amount of ambiguity is necessary to allow the ideas to be understood. The same is true for images. Not everything can be photographed, and diagrams and data visualizations work in a similar way as these AI tools, and that both are graphic abstractions that represent ideas. Stable Diffusion was released on August 10th. It's the 3rd major platform that uses diffusion models this summer. And now we have 3 powerful tools that all do the same kind of thing, but they do it all in slightly different ways. And this has been super exciting for people to talk about on social media. And I'll step through a few examples by Fabian Stelzer. Dalle2 has emerged as the leader in photographic accuracy. And since their commercial organization, many have wondered if that's important for their business model. Stable Diffusion has the reputation for making objects and people with more consistency. So in this case, a light stand looks more like a light stand. But the image libraries for each are not the same. And this shows you the difference between the kind of beauty that Midjourney is focused on and the results from the other two. Dalle2 looks just lost, and Stable Diffusion seems focused on the modifier generative art. So what I'd like to do now is share the next body of work that reflects my more recent thinking. Ultimately, I consider myself to be a business designer. I chose a subject that contains a lot of semantic ambiguity in business, which is infrastructure. As our governments rapidly scramble to react to climate change and macroeconomic shifts, our infrastructure is something that we have a very specific understanding of, but is also too ambiguously large to truly visualize as a concept, yet certainly archetypical enough to imagine. This is bridges and tunnels. This is environmental protection programs and management. It looks like a masterwork by a 19th century Hudson River School painter. While there are some slightly surreal combinations of grass and rock and sky, it's clean and it's calm. This environment feels protected. Carbon reduction programs begins with a traffic jam of cars cut before we see the actual road, but focuses instead slightly above on the factories belching smoke into the sky. The burnt umber palette and the sky at the top of the image is mostly gray and never truly blue. Again, a romanticism permeates. The filth of the image is easily understood as being wrong, but it's also very seductive. I really like this one. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The prompts for this series are all taken from actual US infrastructure grant applications. And I feel that they help us to visualize the potential of these agencies and initiatives in a way that actual photos could never do. Midjourney has visualized this as a series of massive buildings in the mode of gaming PCs with a touch of cyber. The lunching employees in front of the building feel viable. The cathedral made of clouds in the back does not. And I'll be honest and say that I'm unsure about the surreal and fantasy imagery in these images, but at the same time, I really, really like looking at them. Another favorite, this is National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation. Here, the Earth itself has been folded into a fantastic spiral caught between naturalistic dust clouds. But does this represent geophysical data preservation? I don't know. Maybe. Probably the strongest image in the series, surface mining, reclamation, and enforcement, could be an actual photo of pollution out of control. Certainly the AI would have ample images of polluted rivers and crumbling industrial equipment to choose from. To me, this image almost feels like a prophetic vision or even a document of some of the actual challenges we face in reclaiming our industrialized landscape. And I fed about 40 different agencies and grants into the system so far, and this is the only social program that has generated interesting results. Low-income home energy assistance program disparities. The inside-out home in front of cascading volumetric lights certainly creates a mood that the title of the program on its own could never represent. I think that's a hospital bed on the right for an aging relative. There are a few versions of this image for the same program that are just really good. This one seems especially poetic as the humble and empty apartment is lit with the light of a new day. In the center, the sheets from someone sleeping on the floor are nicely folded. And the last image that I have to share from the series is the power grid. It's probably the best example of what I'm attempting to visually figure out, as it's a visualization of an image that could not exist, but could also exist. Understanding what level of semantic ambiguity is legible as a designed image is ultimately what I'm so curious about. What is meaning? Why do we look? On August 22nd, Stable Diffusion open sourced their entire model and made a free API. One of the reasons why this talk has been so difficult for me to write is because we're seeing an explosion of creativity and advancement in this field. Honestly, it's on an hour-by-hour level. And in the last week, there have been 23 new products released that leverage the Stable Diffusion model in everything from textures for 3D design to fashion to video effects. There's a Figma plugin for UX designers. There's an app to generate a video game that you can play and invent in real time. There's an integration for Photoshop using the layers, for Blender, and even a public notebook on Google Colabs. Last week, Midjourney just swapped out part of its model with Stable Diffusion for a day just to see what it would look like and what they could learn from the results. Then 2 days ago, Dalle2 released Outpainting. It allows you to load an image and then add on to it. They demonstrated it by showing the rest of the kitchen from Vermeer's Lady with a Pearl Earring. This kind of innovation is totally amazing. It's happening at such a rate we can barely even understand it. But we owe it to ourselves to consider how we might apply these tools for helping people understand complex information. And so I'll end this video with 2 ideas. The first is that curation will become even more important. If creating images becomes easier, then selecting which is the best representative becomes far more challenging. I've shown you about 120 images in the last, 23 minutes. But when I started, I had 300 images. And the second is that artists and designers will stay in control. While this technology democratizes the image making, nothing will replace good ideas and sharp curation. Designers of all kinds, especially those that work with data, should absolutely get involved and help shape the future of important ways of making and viewing images. Before I end my talk, I just want to also take a second to suggest getting involved with Nightingale. If you don't know, Nightingale is a digital and print magazine about data visualization and information design. We've published over 1,000 articles digitally, and early this year, we shipped our first print magazine to 52 countries. We take submissions from anyone, we pair you with an editor, we even pay you, and then we promote it. It's a pretty good deal. So here's the QR code. Get your copy now. We're pretty much always almost out of stock. And so that's it. My initial thoughts on AI for information designers. Thank you very much for watching the video. Here's my contact information. Drop me a line, write for Nightingale. And also, let's just see how we can continue to push this technology. Thank you.